Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you are looking for the shortcut to being instantly well-informed, you are in the right place. We dive into the source material, extract the key insights, and connect the dots. Today we're undertaking one of the most intense and visually stunning deep dives in ancient literature, the Book of Nahum.
Yeah.
This isn't just history, it's a masterclass in psychological warfare, a propaganda piece written by one nation's god against their oppressor.
It is a stunning, breathtakingly short piece of literature, and our mission today is complex. We're going to unpack how a prophecy dedicated entirely to the total obliteration of the mighty Assyrian Empire, focusing specifically on its capital, Nineveh, became an oracle of profound comfort and radical assurance for the small, beaten-down people of Judah. We're distilling the historical context, the surprising factual details regarding Nineveh's eventual physical destruction, and the text's powerful assertion about the nature of divine power.
That dual nature is so essential. You have this incredibly destructive message, yet it's framed as you said, consolation. Let's start with the prophet who delivered it, Nahum.
Exactly. His name, Nahum, means compassion, consolation, or comfort. On the surface, if you just read the text, which is 3 chapters of just unrelenting judgment, that name feels entirely ironic. But the purpose reveals the meaning. He delivered this consolation to the Judeans during a period when the shadow of Assyria was the darkest, most terrifying reality they faced. The comfort derived entirely from the impending, unavoidable suffering of their oppressor.
And the dating is crucial here because it places the prophecy right in the center of Syrian dominance, but also, right before their precipitous collapse.
We can bracket this ministry with astonishing precision. Our sources indicate he wrote after a major historical event that he uses as a rhetorical device later in the book, and that event was the fall of the Egyptian capital city of Thebes.
Right, which was conquered by the Assyrians themselves.
Yes, by King Ashurbanipal in 663 BC. And crucially, Nahum wrote before the event he was predicting, the catastrophic fall of Nineveh itself, which occurred in 612 BC.
So we're looking at a period that spans just a few decades.
A very narrow window. He was likely ministering around 630 BC, a volatile time in Judah. This places his prophetic activity squarely within the reigns of either the famously wicked King Manasseh, who was actually a vassal of Assyria for much of his life, or the early reforming years of the good King Josiah of Judah. Either way, the Assyrian threat, their demands for tribute, their military presence, their sheer terror, was an overwhelming daily reality for every Judean family.
What's important for us to grasp is the destination versus the audience. The prophecy is aimed at Nineveh, but it's intended for the Jews.
That's the key structural component of the whole book. Nahum was a Jewish prophet, writing primarily for the Jewish people. We see this pattern elsewhere. Think of Obadiah, who focused only on Edom, or even Jonah, who was sent to Nineveh itself. But the entire purpose of those written texts was the encouragement and instruction of the Judean audience. Nahum, who was likely both a writing and preaching prophet in Judah, served to reinforce this message of ultimate, certain deliverance to a nation that felt hopelessly trapped.
And to feel the full weight of the prophecy, we have to appreciate the target. Nineveh wasn't just a big city. It was the symbol of absolute, terrifying global supremacy.
Absolutely. When we talk about Nineveh, we are talking about the undisputed center of the known world, the heart of the great Assyrian Empire. It had a deep, ancient history, tracing its founding all the way back to Nimrod, as the text in Genesis notes. Geographically, its scale was immense. It sat on the east bank of the Tigris River, which provided a natural boundary for the west.
But the defenses were something else entirely.
The defenses were staggering.
Let's get granular on the scale. When we say staggering, what does that look like on the ground?
We are talking about colossal engineering projects. An 8-mile wall protected its northern and eastern boundaries alone. The city walls themselves were up to 150 feet high and often wide enough to drive chariots on, sometimes even triple-layered. The section within the walls was nearly 3 miles in diameter at its greatest width. If you imagine yourself standing there, historians estimate the population could have been as high as 150,000, maybe more, and that's not even counting the sprawling suburbs outside the walls.
That detail about the walking distance is one of those nuggets that just hammers home the sheer size.
It does. Our sources confirm that the biblical description found elsewhere in the Book of Jonah, that it took a 3-day walk just to traverse Nineveh, or at least its greater area of jurisdiction, was not an exaggeration. This wasn't a town. This was a gargantuan metropolis, a fusion of military command center, trade hub, and the ultimate symbol of imperial dominance. And this is the place Nahum promises will vanish.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the audience is the people of Judah, What was the explicit purpose of this text beyond just announcing Nineveh's fall? What specific assurance did it provide?
The assurance was centered on divine sovereignty and justice. The book is introduced as an oracle, which encompasses both uplifting, consolation and threatening judgment prophecy. Its core mission was to deliver three things to the Judean listener. First, the irreversible fall of Nineveh is guaranteed. Second, their God, Yahweh, is completely sovereign over world events, even over the Assyrians. And third, that he is definitively, profoundly just.
The cruelty of Nineveh is what provides that justification for this kind of total destruction, isn't it? They weren't just a military superpower, they were exceptionally evil.
That is precisely the justification, and it's critical. Yahweh would destroy Nineveh as punishment for their relentless, widespread cruelty, not just to Judah, but to many nations. They were infamous. We're talking about the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, resulting in the exile of the 10 northern tribes, and their continued harassment of Judah, destroying vast portions of the Judean countryside and besieging Jerusalem in 701 BC, which failed only because of divine intervention. Nahum's message was a rock-solid assurance that the nightmare they were trapped in had an expiration date, and that date was determined by a moral ledger kept by God.
Just a quick note on the technical language within the text itself. The prophet uses a device called metonymy quite frequently. Can you elaborate on that and why he uses it?
It's important because it adds poetic density. Metonymy is simply using the name of one thing to represent something closely associated with it. For example, using the White House to mean the U.S. presidency. Nahum frequently uses prominent city names, like Jerusalem, to stand in for the entire country of Judah or even all Israel. This allows the text to be deeply specific, addressing the city where the listeners live, while simultaneously conveying a message that applies to the entire covenant people group. In essence, the Assyrian plot against this place will result in their own annihilation.
That sets the stage perfectly for the core tension of the prophecy. We move now into the opening assertion of the text, Nahum 1.18, where we encounter this profound paradox. Nineveh has exhausted divine patience, yet the one who judges is simultaneously slow to anger.
This section opens with an assertion that Nineveh's behavior had moved beyond correction or reprieve. They had completely violated righteous standards and used their power to systematically oppress. They had pushed the divine tolerance beyond a point of no return.
And this is where we meet the divine warrior, who seem to carry two contradictory traits in a single description. On the one hand, he is defined by furious, avenging zeal.
He is a zealous and avenging God. Let's pause on that word, zealous. It doesn't just mean jealous in a trivial sense. It speaks to his covenant fervor. It's a zealous, consuming passion for the protection of his own people and a corresponding, furious, intense judgment against his enemies. He sustains his rage against his foes, meaning the passion for justice doesn't just burn out. It's an assertion of absolute moral accountability that is fueled by divine love for Judah.
But if he is zealous, why did he allow the Assyrian terror to continue for so long? The very next line, as you mentioned, introduces the restraint.
Yes. The counterbalance is immediate, but he is also slow to anger, but great in power. What's fascinating here is that the very fact that he is slow to anger is the theological explanation for why Assyria was permitted to abuse Israel for nearly a century after Jonah. Patience, in human eyes, might look like weakness, but Nahum argues it's a strategic, terrifying delay before an inevitable and thorough judgment.
I think the reference back to the prophet Jonah really crystallizes this concept of patience.
It absolutely does. Jonah was sent about a century before Nahum prophesied. He warned the Ninevites, they repented, and God reprieved them. That historical precedent is the evidence of his being slow to anger. But Nahum arrives with the explicit message that the repentance was fleeting, the century of grace has run out, and the window for patience has slammed shut. Nineveh's descendants have returned to the same, if not worse, wickedness.
So if the Assyrians made the fatal mistake of interpreting that divine slowness as weakness, Nahum shifts immediately to the second part of the declaration. He is great in power.
And this is the terrifying part for Nineveh. If the ultimate judge is slow to act, but when he does act, he is great in power, then the thoroughness of the judgment is guaranteed. The sources emphasize that God will not allow the wicked to go unpunished. Judgment is not an option, it is an eventual certainty.
To illustrate this immense power, Nahum skips over political and military examples and moves straight to cosmic forces that dwarf any earthly empire. What's the theological punch of using whirlwind, storm, and sea?
These aren't just poetic metaphors, they are specific symbols in ancient Near Eastern cosmology. The whirlwind and storm are manifestations of his angry character god marching out in his terrifying, uncontrollable element. But the control over water is even more profound. Water often symbolized chaos, the untamable force of nature.
Right, the sea and rivers.
Yes. Nahum says a simple word from Yahweh can cause the humanly uncontrollable sea and rivers to dry up. For the Jewish listener, this instantly calls to mind two iconic moments in their history: the parting of the Red Sea during the Exodus and the stopping of the Jordan River that allowed them to enter the Promised Land. The implication is staggering. The same power that manipulated the fundamental forces of the planet for Israel's deliverance can now manipulate those forces for Nineveh's destruction.
So if he can control chaos, the very earth is next.
Precisely. He moves beyond liquid chaos to solid foundation. He produces earthquakes and landslides. Mountains, which represent the most stable, most permanent physical features on the planet, tremble before him. The prophet recalls Mount Sinai quaking when God revealed himself there. His very presence causes the entire earth and all its inhabitants to convulse and upheave. What stands out here is that if mountains, which define eternity on earth, cannot withstand his anger, how can a city built of brick and clay possibly stand?
This realization must have been a profound comfort to the Judean listener who felt insignificant next to the Assyrian might.
It's the ultimate scaling exercise. If God can move mountains and dry up the seas and rivers, if he can make the literal foundations of the earth convulse, the vast, seemingly immovable Assyrian Empire is not too large or too strong for him to overthrow. Scale is irrelevant to divine power. Their walls are just footnotes.
And the power of his wrath, when it's finally released, is described as irresistible.
It is described in volcanic terms. No one can survive Yahweh's unchecked wrath. His anger is poured out like volcanic fire, breaking up boulders. And here, Nahum brings in a historical memory that the Assyrians themselves should have learned from. When God destroyed their army surrounding Jerusalem in a single night, that time they besieged the city in 701 BC, they experienced a sharp, sudden preview of his power. They were warned, they felt the heat of the fire, and yet they continued in their arrogance.
What I love about this opening is how skillfully Nahum pivots from the terrifying display of cosmic power to a personalized message of security for his audience. It's the dual outcome in verses 7 and 8.
It fundamentally divides the world into two categories of relationship with this divine warrior. For those who trust and obey Yahweh, the message is profoundly reassuring. The Lord is good indeed. He is a fortress in time of distress, and he protects those who seek refuge in him. He is not just a protector. He is a fortress, the most secure refuge available, far superior to Nineveh's 150-foot walls.
But for Nineveh, that same power is channeled into their ruin.
For Nineveh. But with an overwhelming flood, he will make a complete end of Nineveh. He will drive his enemies into darkness. And this isn't just poetic fancy. The historical note confirms this astonishing specificity. When the coalition of Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians jointly overthrew Nineveh in 612 BC, historical records indicate that heavy rains caused the Tigris River, or perhaps one of its tributaries, to overflow. This flooding washed away parts of Nineveh's massive walls, directly fulfilling the prophecy of the overwhelming flood. It was the ultimate irony. Their defense became their executioner.
It's hard to believe how precisely he details the fall of Nineveh, right down to the river failing them, decades before it happened. That kind of precision is what would have hammered home the message to the Judeans. This is real. This is guaranteed.
It lends undeniable authority to the entire oracle. And that transition brings us into section 2, where Nahum focuses on the end of the Assyrian dynasty itself. Yahweh publicly ridicules Nineveh's plans and promises total, permanent deliverance for Judah.
This part, Nahum 1.911, is dedicated to proving that any plot against the Lord or against his people is completely futile and will result in permanent destruction.
Nahum asks rhetorically, "What are you plotting against the Lord?" He then answers with a divine guarantee. He will completely destroy. Distress will not arise a second time. The idea is that Yahweh will not only frustrate their current attempts to thwart his will, but he will ensure that the Assyrian threat is permanently removed. They might succeed once, but they will not endure.
And there is that clear, powerful historical reference point that the Judean audience would have understood instantly when he mentions a second time.
Yes. The prophet is almost certainly referring back to King Sennacherib of Assyria, who besieged Jerusalem once in 701 BC. The divine intervention we mentioned earlier completely destroyed his army overnight, humiliating the king. The Assyrians never successfully besieged Jerusalem a second time. The leader who continually plots evil against Yahweh and Judah will be destroyed in perpetuity.
The imagery used to describe the utter consumption of Nineveh is chaotic and highly flammable. They will be totally consumed like entangled thorn bushes, like the drink of drunkards, like very dry stubble.
It paints a picture of quick, overwhelming destruction. Think about entangled thorn bushes. They're initially dense and difficult to penetrate, symbolizing the city's complex defenses. But once fire touches them, they burn fast and hot. Dry stubble is instantly consumable. The message is that the immense structure of the city, its defenses, and its resistance will be annihilated rapidly and completely, leaving no lingering resistance.
The prophet follows this destructive imagery with the exhilarating promise for Judah in verses 12-15. Even though Assyria is so numerous and powerful, they will be cut off and just trickle away.
The core promise is irreversible, permanent deliverance. Though I afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. The suffering under Assyria was framed in part as divine discipline for Judah's own sins, but the instrument of that discipline, Assyria, had crossed the line into pure, unchecked cruelty. Now God promises to physically liberate them, saying, He will break Assyria's yoke bar and tear apart the shackles from Judah's neck. Freedom is not earned. It is delivered by a sovereign God.
And the ultimate humiliation is directed straight at the core of Assyrian identity, their leadership and their gods in verse 14.
This is a devastating divine decree. First, the political end. Assyria's dynasty will end. There will be no succession, no continuation of the Ashurbanipal lineage. Second, the spiritual end. God promises to destroy the idols and images in their temples.
Why is the destruction of the idols so significant for the Assyrians? What does that signal?
In the ancient Near East, the strength of the state was inseparable from the perceived power of its gods. When Assyria conquered a city, they would often take the local gods' statues captive, demonstrating that their own gods, Ashur and Ishtar, were superior. By reversing this, God is declaring that He will destroy the very symbols of Assyrian state power, proving their gods are utterly useless. It's an ideological coup, not just a physical one.
And the final, most personal and devastating blow is the promise. I will desecrate your grave because you are accursed.
This is where we need to spend some time because this is the greatest possible curse in that culture. The idea of spiritual security after death was everything. In the ancient Near East, personal identity, family continuity, and spiritual honor were tied to having a proper burial and descendants who would perform the required rituals to sustain your memory.
So the desecration of the grave means total annihilation of memory and spiritual security.
Precisely. Having no descendants meant your name vanished from history and no one was left to honor you or provide offerings. Desecrating the grave meant the soul was disturbed, restless, and completely cut off from eternal peace. Yahweh promises not only to ensure the end of the dynasty, but also that He will prepare Nineveh's grave. He will bury the contemptible city itself in ruin and contempt. Its total, irrecoverable erasure from history and memory.
This total certainty allows the prophet to speak as if the deliverance has already happened, even decades before the event.
Yes, the tension is resolved prophetically right here. A herald is already seen running on the mountains bringing the good news. Celebrate your sacred festivals, O Judah. Fulfill your sacred vows. For never again will the wicked Assyrians invade you. They have been completely destroyed. The sum total is a permanent end to the Assyrian nation as a threat.
And this message of the triumphant messenger carrying good news has such profound literary echoes.
It is foundational imagery. That exact statement, the messenger proclaiming good news, appears verbatim later in Isaiah, announcing the later defeat of Babylon and the return from exile. Even more significantly, the Apostle Paul quotes the first part of this verse in Romans in reference to the ultimate heralds, the gospel messengers. It shows that Nahum's message of geopolitical deliverance from the tyranny of Assyria serves as an archetype for future, greater spiritual deliverances. And the historical outcome confirms the magnitude of the prophecy. Nineveh was destroyed and was never rebuilt. It became a rumor in the sand.
So the core takeaway of this section is clear. When God's avenging wrath is finally provoked, it's not just a defeat, it's an erasure. But for the people of faith, that same power is channeled into permanent comfort and liberation.
A permanent liberation. And now Nahum shifts from theological declaration into a cinematic, visceral vision of the siege itself. He takes the Judean listeners, who have only ever experienced Assyrian cruelty, and puts them on the walls of Nineveh to watch their enemy fall.
This transition into Section 3, Nahum 2.110, is absolutely one of the most vivid, fast-paced battle descriptions in all in ancient literature. It begins with great irony. A taunt song against the city's ability to defend itself.
It's a bitter, mocking challenge. Nahum ironically challenges the Ninevites to use their famous strength. Guard the rampart, watch the road, prepare yourselves for battle, muster your mighty strength. The mockery is heavy because these desperate last-ditch measures will be entirely futile against the divine plan. The motivation is clear. Yahweh's plan will restore the majesty of Jacob and Israel, whose wealth, prestige, and fields had been utterly plundered and destroyed by these Assyrians.
The description of the invading army is a terrifying spectacle of color and flashing light. This isn't just a military report, it's a terrifying, high-contrast painting.
The invaders are described in brilliant, terrifying detail, reflecting their ferocity and preparation. Their shields are dyed red. The mighty soldiers are dressed in scarlet garments. The use of red and scarlet suggests both military rank and the blood that is about to be spilled. The chariots have flashing metal fittings on the day of battle, and the soldiers brandish glimmering spears. This visualization would have been deeply unsettling, reminding the Judeans of the overwhelming power of a successful invasion.
And the movement of the attack is likened to uncontrollable natural phenomena.
The speed is paralyzing. The chariots are racing madly through the broad plazas and streets, looking like torches or lightning bolts dashing here and there. Imagine the noise, the chaos, the speed. It shatters any attempt at organized defense. The Assyrian king attempts to rally his command structure, calling on his nobles, but they stumble in their haste. They rush to the city wall to set up their covered siege towers, but the prophet makes it clear. They are already too late. The internal panic has begun.
This is where the prophecy from chapter 1 locks into the vision. The role of water.
This is the critical, guaranteed moment in the fall. The sluice gates are opened, the royal palace is deluged and dissolves. This is the specific fulfillment of the overwhelming flood prophecy we discussed. Nineveh was reliant on its complex water defenses and canals, which usually its strength, but the prophet describes the exact mechanism of its failure. The water, possibly an actual flood exacerbated by the enemy or heavy rains, erodes the foundations of those massive mud brick walls, causing the entire royal center, the symbol of their power, to literally dissolve.
The result is immediate panic and mass exile, but Nahum paints this through a powerful social contrast.
The devastation is total, crossing all social boundaries. Nineveh is taken into exile and led away. The lament is universal. The prophet describes the slave girls, the very lowest of the social scale, moaning like doves and beating their breasts. But they are lamenting alongside the nobles, the highest echelons of society. This shows that no class, no matter how protected, escape the judgment. The entire social fabric collapses at once.
The flight of the population is again described using a water analogy, emphasizing the sheer, uncontrollable chaos.
It's the ultimate image of failed control. Nineveh's people run away in panic like water gushing from a broken dam. Someone cries out in a desperate attempt to rally the defense, "Stop! Stop!" But the panic is too absolute. They have internalized the fear and no one turns back. The city is essentially abandoning itself to fate.
And the invaders move in for the final, greedy act, the plunder of the famed Assyrian treasures.
The conquerors cry out, "Plunder the silver! Plunder the gold!" Nineveh had hoarded unimaginable treasures from centuries of brutal conquest across the Near East. The text emphasizes that there is no end to the treasure. The aftermath is immediate and visceral: destruction, devastation, and desolation. The physical effect on the remaining inhabitants is described with horrifying physiological detail. Their hearts faint, their knees tremble, their stomachs churn, and their faces turn pale. The judgment is not just external, it is absolute internal physical panic.
That detailed visual breakdown really brings the abstract idea of destruction down to a human level of terror. We transition now into section 4, which deals with the profound irony of the Assyrians, the predator becoming the prey, and the ultimate exposure of the city's spiritual and moral sins.
This is a section steeped in cultural satire. The Assyrian kings absolutely reveled in their ferocity. They constantly likened themselves to lions. The Assyrian reliefs often depict the king hunting lions, establishing their mastery over the most powerful animal. King Sennacherib himself boasted in his annals of his military fury by saying, "Like a lion I raged." They projected an image of invincible power and predatory dominance.
But the prophet takes this symbol, the lion's den, and turns it into the central target of a taunt. The taunt is devastating because it attacks their very identity. Where now is the den of the lions and the feeding place of the young lions? The Assyrians were notoriously cruel. They weren't like natural predators who killed only for sustenance. Assyrians killed, tortured, and maimed specifically for the joy of conquest, using terror as a deliberate military policy. Now, their secure haunts, Nineveh, the imperial den, are desolate, quiet, and empty.
The imagery continues. The leaders were lion-like, and their youth were like young lions who plundered others, but now they are devoured by the sword.
Yahweh declares, I am against you. Their chariots, the instruments of their speed and terror, will burn. The sword will devour their young lions, meaning their next generation of leaders and soldiers will be wiped out. Critically, they will no longer prey upon the land. Their function as the world's ultimate predator is over, and perhaps the most satisfying detail for the Judeans. The voices of their messengers, the diplomats who delivered the arrogant, threatening edicts and demanded crippling tribute, will no longer be heard. Their global authority is silenced forever.
This sets the stage for listing the actual specific sins of Nineveh in 3.1. What were they internationally notorious for?
The sources list the explicit, horrific atrocities that made the Assyrians infamous in the ancient world. Their cruelty was ritualized and used for terror propaganda. This included the specific acts of cutting off hands, feet, ears, and noses, gouging out eyes, lopping off heads, and impaling bodies, and the absolutely ghastly practice of peeling the skin off living victims and displaying them in city squares. They were a city guilty of bloodshed, constantly full of lies, treachery, and hoarding spoil. They were continually on the prowl for new nations to conquer, driven by pure greed.
The prophet is then granted a heightened, almost surreal vision of this horrific end, years or decades in advance.
It becomes a total sensory overload. Nahum hears the cracking whips, the ground shaking violently from chariot wheels, the galloping horses, and the war chariots bolting forward. He sees the charging charioteers, flashing swords, and the glimmering spears, resulting in piles of the dead and countless casualties so dense that the incoming armies actually stumble over the mounds of corpses. The destruction is a chaotic, saturated bloodbath.
The final, brutal taunt against the city is the extended metaphor of the harlot city. This accusation is devastating because it attacks not just their morality, but their method of imperial control.
Nineveh is branded a wanton prostitute and a seductive mistress who practices sorcery. This isn't just about literal sexual degeneracy. It's a statement about their political and spiritual methods of control. The harlot city metaphor means they used glamour, seductive promises, and manipulative alliances, the attractions, to lure weaker nations in.
And the sorcery element, what does that refer to?
That links directly back to the Assyrians' desperate reliance on occultism and the spirit world for power. They sought magical arts to control their destiny and predict or control their victims, rather than relying on justice or covenant. Their pagan worship itself often involved sexual perversion and human degradation. By using these immoral attractions and magical arts, they lured nations into servitude and sold them into slavery.
Because Assyria had made so many others feel detestable and ashamed, God promises to do the exact same thing to them. The prophetic image of public humiliation is perhaps the most shocking and visceral in the entire book.
It's designed to express utter, irreversible contempt. God promises to strip off Nineveh's clothes, exposing her nakedness and shame to all the surrounding nations. But the ultimate insult is the image of God covering Nineveh with human excrement filth and making her a public spectacle, literally lifting her up for all the world to behold as a disgusting, contaminated sight. It symbolizes their moral and spiritual degradation being publicly exposed and punished.
And the world's reaction is not sorrow or fear, but profound, unreserved relief and celebration.
The world would rejoice. Everyone who sees you will turn away from you in disgust. They will say, Nineveh has been devastated. Who will lament for her? The world would recoil from her, and crucially, they would cheer when Nineveh fell. The total absence of mourners is the final confirmation of the magnitude of their evil. Even if you paid people to mourn, no one would weep for Nineveh.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and it's a brilliant rhetorical strategy. In the final section, why does Nahum choose to bring up a city that has already fallen, Thebes, and one that was actually destroyed by Assyria?
This is the historical anchor that seals the argument and provides the final, inescapable precedent for Nineveh. Thebes, which Nahum calls No Ammon, was the capital of Upper Egypt, modern Karnak or Luxor. It was universally seen as mighty, and crucially, it was surrounded by superb water defenses, the Nile River, canals, and moats. Nineveh relied on the same solid and liquid defenses.
And Thebes fell to the Assyrians themselves in 63 BC.
Precisely. Nahum's argument is devastatingly logical for the Ninevite reader. If Thebes' impregnable, solid, and liquid defenses could not protect it from conquest, especially a conquest executed by you, then Nineveh's defenses will also fail when God brings judgment. They cannot claim immunity or superior engineering. What happened to your victim will happen to you.
The prophet revisits the atrocities that Thebes suffered at the hands of Assyria to make a direct point about divine reciprocity.
Thebes went into captivity and exile, but the Assyrians were especially cruel, using their standard terror tactics. Nahum reminds them. Thebes' infants were smashed to pieces at the head of every street. Their honorable men were humiliated, auctioned off as slaves, and dragged away in chains. The prophet states explicitly, the exact same fate awaits Nineveh. What goes around comes around. The iron law of divine justice ensures the same measure of cruelty they meted out will be a return to them.
And the Ninevites will lose their famed ferocity and powers of self-control.
They will lose all agency. This refers back to the imagery of them being totally consumed, like the drink of drunkards. They will lose self-control not through literal excessive drinking, but metaphorically, by imbibing the cup of wrath from Yahweh. They will collapse and vanish from the world stage. Their lion-like aggression will turn into panicked, drunken flight.
The prophet then turns his attention back to the physical defenses, declaring they will utterly fail. Let's talk about the fig tree analogy. It's perfect for describing rapid collapse.
It's highly effective. Nineveh's fortifications are likened to a fig tree laden with ripe, low-hanging fruit. Ripe figs fall off easily, sometimes just by touching them. If the tree is shaken, the fruit representing the city's defenses and inhabitants falls immediately into the mouth of the eater. The implication is that those massive, impressive walls will crumble instantly, especially due to the water erosion that had already been prophesied. They won't withstand a concerted push.
And the psychological effect on their famed ferocious warriors.
They will be completely demoralized. The text says they will become like women in your midst, defenseless, vulnerable, and fearful. This is the ultimate reversal of their lion-like predatory identity. Their defenses are worthless. Their gates will be left wide open because fire will consume their bars.
There's a final, suggested, futile effort.
Sure.
What if the Ninevites try to strengthen their defenses, draw water for a siege, and make new mud bricks?
It is utterly hopeless. The text says that even if they make these frantic, desperate efforts, trying to shore up their defenses under attack fire will consume them right where they build, and the sword will cut them down. The crushing realization is that their magnificent walls will not be a defense. They will become the walls of their tomb. Their destruction will be swift and total, like a devastating locust invasion that leaves nothing behind.
The image of the defenders fleeing continues with two distinct, brilliant analogies involving the locust, the merchants and the officials. This attacks their economic and governmental structure simultaneously.
Nahum uses the locust analogy because locusts are numerous, they spread rapidly, and they consume everything in their path. The Assyrian traders, who increased the country's vast wealth and were numerous like the stars of heaven, were responsible for the flow of gold and silver. But when invasion comes, they will be like young locusts that simply shed their skin and fly away in vast numbers, prioritizing personal flight over defending the city's treasury. The economy collapses first.
And the officials and courtiers, the very structure of the government, also flee.
They are also like a swarm of locusts. Nahum saw them taking their place on the walls in the cool of the day, seemingly prepared for a long defense. But when the heat of battle comes, when the sun rises metaphorically on their day of reckoning, they desert their posts and flee. The phrase is chilling. No one knows where they are. The leadership structure dissolves instantly under pressure, leaving the citizenry completely leaderless.
This leads us directly to the concluding dirge, the final, painful humiliation of the Assyrian king and the total destruction of the empire.
Nahum addresses the king of Assyria, directly likely referring to Ashur-uballit, who is trying to hold the fragments of the empire together from Haran after Nineveh fell. The accusation is simple: failed leadership. The shepherds and officers are sleeping or slumbering asleep at the switch, completely checked out or incompetent.
And the consequence of that vanished leadership.
The ordinary citizens are scattered like sheep on the mountains without any direction or organization. There is no one available to regather them into the imperial fold. The immense, sprawling structure of the empire dissolves into leaderless chaos.
And the final, cruel insult. Assyria's destruction is impossible to repair, a fatal injury. And who will mourn?
No one. The wound is incurable. Mourners will not be found. In fact, the opposite is true. Nahum concludes with the world's definitive judgment on the empire. All who hear what has happened to you will clap their hands for joy, for no one ever escaped your endless cruelty. This confirms that their reputation for sheer terror was global. The world collectively breathes a massive sigh of relief at Nineveh's demise.
So to bring it all together,
If we connect this back to the core mission, Nahum gives us a profound lesson in global moral justice. Nineveh suffered a fatal illness driven by its own wickedness and lost its independent character forever, vanishing entirely from the geopolitical map, just as the prophet foretold.
so what does this all mean for us, the learner?
today. Nahum's oracle of comfort through destruction hinges on specific behaviors that provoke this type of divine justice. If we distill the text, what are the core fatal illnesses that brought down the world's greatest power?
We see a clear 5-point blueprint of what brought about this total irreversible judgment. First, a relentless lust for conquest and expansion beyond measure. Second, the systematic practice of violence and brutality to dominate others, the joy of conquest. Third, the abuse of power and systematic oppression of the weak and vulnerable. Fourth, idolatry, relying on and worshiping anything but the God of the Bible for security and power. And fifth, critically, seeking help, guidance, and power from the demonic world through occultism and sorcery. These moral and spiritual degradations were the fatal illnesses.
Nahum's vision wasn't just a historical anecdote about a failed empire. It's a template for divine accountability and a powerful argument for the security of those who choose refuge in a God who is both slow to anger and great in power.
Indeed. It demonstrates that history ultimately bends toward justice, and that every empire, no matter how powerful or ruthless, eventually faces a final audit. The greatest comfort for the Judeans, and for us, is that when human military strategy fails, the world is still governed by a divine warrior and military strategist whose power dwarfs mountains, controls chaos, and guarantees the permanent deliverance of his people. The question for you to mull over is this. If the judgment of Nineveh was the inevitable consequence of relying on human cruelty and occult power, what enduring source of strength does your own security rely on?